Welcome to the pickup demonstration lesson. In this lesson, we will take the Huey off the ground and into a low altitude hover and ground effect, IGE, to demonstrate the initial step of a takeoff and basic hover control. For this lesson, the helicopter is lightly loaded and the weather is ideal with no wind. Control requirements will vary with increased takeoff weight and will be more difficult in windy conditions. Use the controls indicator to monitor the position of the flight controls. Remember, the flight controls of a helicopter are almost never stationary in flight, in particular the cyclic and especially during a hover. When performing a takeoff, be prepared to constantly make fine adjustments to the controls. Let's take a look at the position of the flight controls. At mission start, the cyclic and pedals are neutralized in the center. The collective is in a fully down position. Unfortunately, the starting position of the controls isn't very useful for flight. The position of the controls for any particular flight regime, including a hover, depend on airspeed, altitude, aircraft weight, payload, weather, and other conditions. However, the approximate hover position of the controls will generally be with the cyclic back and left and the left pedal pressed in. I will now set my controls in the approximate hover position. Watch the positions of the cyclic and pedals on the controls indicator. Once your controls are set in the approximate hover position, begin to very slowly raise the collective. Do this slowly enough to give yourself time to counteract any movement you detect from the helicopter. Counter any roll and sliding tendency with very light opposite cyclic. Counter any nose yaw with very light opposite pedal. Pay attention to how the cyclic is used continuously to make fine adjustments in attitude, and the pedals are used to maintain heading. Find a visual reference point well ahead of the helicopter. This will help to maintain closer visual cues like the runway markings within your peripheral vision to help you detect movement. Allow the helicopter to settle at a desired altitude and let the collective rest in place. The helicopter hovers best near the ground, where ground effect acts like an air cushion below the helicopter. Ground effect is only present to an altitude of approximately half of the rotor's diameter, or about 24 feet. It is reduced as altitude increases. Climbing above this altitude will transition you out of ground effect, OGE, which demands more engine power to maintain. Hovering out of ground effect may be impossible with high takeoff weights or in hot and high conditions. When performing a takeoff, you will proceed with the transition to forward flight from a hover altitude of about 3 feet skid height. This concludes the pickup demonstration lesson. Welcome to the takeoff demonstration lesson. In this lesson, we will transition from a low altitude hover into forward flight to complete the takeoff. You should already be familiar with the pickup lesson and be able to take the helicopter off the ground and into a hover and ground effect, IGE. Use the controls indicator to monitor the position of the flight controls. One of the critical elements of this lesson is the change in the position of the controls seen as we pick up airspeed and transition the helicopter from a hover into forward flight. Pay attention to the position of the cyclic and pedals in the hover and how they are operated as we accelerate forward. As always, it's important to make sure your control inputs are smooth and continuous, giving you plenty of time to balance the helicopter and keep it flying where you want it to and not where it wants to fly you. I will now bring the helicopter to a low altitude hover as demonstrated in the pickup lesson. Take a note of the positions of the flight controls. To begin the transition to forward flight, dip the nose down very slightly with a little forward stick. As the helicopter begins to move forward, the lower pitch angle will result in a slight descent, requiring a slight increase of the collective at the same time. Your goal is to minimize climb until you reach a safe climbing speed of at least 30 knots. You also want to keep the skids aligned with your ground track in case you end up on the ground. Use the pedals to keep the slip ball centered to minimize side slip, and the right instrument column to maintain heading. The vibrations indicate that you are passing through effective translational lift, or ETL, which means you are flying fast enough to be ahead of your own turbulence and the rotors are becoming increasingly more efficient in the smooth air. This results in a tendency to balloon the helicopter upward, raising the nose up and yawing left. These tendencies need to be anticipated and compensated for by pushing the stick forward to prevent an early climb and decreasing left pedal input to maintain heading. Notice the position of the flight controls now as compared to the hover position we started with. The cyclic is much more forward and right, while the pedals are almost neutral. After reaching a safe climbing speed of at least 30 knots, you can proceed with a climb to your desired altitude at an airspeed that provides the best climb rate, which is generally between 60 to 80 knots. This concludes the takeoff demonstration lesson.